Good evening, everyone. Hey, I'm Andy Masick. I'm the president here at the Heinz History Center, and I'm delighted that you turned out tonight for our Smithsonian Lecture Series. This is going to be an ongoing series, and that's part of our wonderful partnership with the world's largest museum, the Smithsonian Institution, and we're a proud affiliate here in Pittsburgh. That means we have a contract with the Smithsonian that requires us to have Smithsonian objects on exhibit at all times here, and we share staff and information and collections over the years. Some of you have been members for a good number of years and remember the Destination Moon exhibit that we had in 2018 when we showcased the Columbia capsule and other wonderful things from the Smithsonian's collection. Well, our speaker tonight is in charge of those collections. Dr. Margaret Weitekamp is the head of the Department of Space Exploration at the Smithsonian National Museum, Air and Space Museum in Washington. She's also the curator of collections, and she'll have to tell you more about what a curator does versus the head of a department at the Smithsonian. But they've got a lot of things going on. I'm not going to talk very long because I'm eager to hear what Dr. Weitekamp has to say. But you should know that she is an author, a scholar. She graduated from the University of Pittsburgh. She earned her PhD, Pittsburgh, and her PhD from Cornell University. But she has authored a number of fascinating articles and books. Her most recent book is titled Space Craze, America's Enduring Fascination with Real and Imagined Spaceflight. She'll tell you more about that, but if you want your very own copy of Space Craze, they're for sale out there. Most of you are members, so you get a discount on Space Craze, and if you're not a member, well, you could join tonight and get a discount on all of your purchases. Without further ado, I'd like you to help me welcome Dr. Margaret Weitekamp.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to be here. So I thought that I would start you off where we were just talking about. In December of 2018, the National Air and Space Museum hosted the kickoff event for the 50th anniversary of the Apollo missions, and we held that at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. So that Spirit of Apollo event started with the Apollo 8 Christmas broadcast. And I actually ended up sitting right here. This is kind of my cell phone snap of the space window in the National Cathedral, which has a little bit of lunar material right at the center of that top circle in the design. And I'm going to return to that a couple of times in my talk tonight, because the idea of cathedral building, I think, provides an important, if imperfect, metaphor for thinking about my topic today, which is really thinking about collecting, right? So many of you are members of this museum, you've been to the exhibits, you've seen the collections, but I wanted to talk in a little more detail about what's the history of how those things come into the collection and how our thinking about that changes. So by the time we were having this event in the December of 2018, we had already realized that the National Mall building for the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum was going to be closed in 2019. We're still finishing a massive renovation, which meant that the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, which is kind of a big deal in our neck of the woods, for the first human landing on the moon in 2019, we were going to have the building closed. So while I was at the National Cathedral for the Apollo 8 anniversary, the Destination Moon exhibit was actually here. We came up with this traveling exhibit to Travel Columbia, that central command module that brought Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins back from the moon in July of 1969, to 4 different cities. And it was in fact here at the Heinz History Center when I was sitting under that space window. So I thought that for the kickoff of this Smithsonian Lecture Series here at the Heinz History Center, given the strong connections that we have between the Smithsonian, especially the National Air and Space Museum, and this wonderful museum, I thought I would take that broad look at the nation's collection of Apollo artifacts that are held by the Smithsonian. So from spacecraft to memorabilia, and re-examine how it was that that collection was assembled. Because when you start looking at that, there are real patterns in how the Apollo artifacts were accessioned into the Smithsonian Institution's National Collection. And I think I can show you some distinct phases in that artifact collecting, and then how that also reflects how curators have thought about this history, and really how we've understood the functions of these artifacts, how they've moved from testimony to commemoration, and finally to symbolism. And Pittsburgh has been an important site for both creating and sharing that history. So I'll come back to this metaphor of cathedral building, because I often think of museum work as cathedral building, a project that transcends any one lifetime or career. So when building cathedrals centuries ago, the masons who laid the foundations would likely not be alive when the spires were finally finished. These were things that took hundreds of years or generations to complete. And as a result, you had generations of workers adding their own contributions, such that in the end, the final building, sometimes actually, if you go to tour a cathedral, you'll sometimes find the base of it has a different architectural style than you'll find farther up in different arches, in different spires. And I think about that kind of transgenerational work when I'm thinking a lot of times about artifacts at the museum. So my job as a curator is to collect things for the National Collection with the idea that I'm building on the work of my predecessors, and those who come after me are going to continue to work with these objects. They'll have different interpretations, they'll have different insights for it. And really the idea is not that anything that I do kind of completes the edifice, but that I'm trying to make sure that we are collecting well-chosen pieces so that we'll be able to continue to build and be able to support not only collections and exhibits, but also research. Because artifacts really then inform both of those functions of museums. So we always think about what is a rich object that would tell a story that we can center an exhibit on, bring people in, give them that authentic experience with the object. But the National Air and Space Museum also exists, our kind of primary function, aside from being a very traveled exhibit site. We're an object library, right? We're a research center. And the idea is really that if we've done our jobs right as curators, if we've collected the right things, that generations from now, when people want to know the real history of aviation and spaceflight, they should be able to come to these objects and have that authentic experience and learn from them. So I thought that I would use that as a preface to talking a little bit about the Air and Space Museum and how we got these collections. So the National Air and Space Museum started as the National Air Museum in 1946 as a larger part of the Smithsonian Institution, which is itself a research institution that became the National Museum at the end of the 19th century. So by 1966, they had added "and space" to the name as the space age has begun. And the initial collection of U.S. human spaceflight vehicles was done when the museum didn't have its own building. It was housed instead here. This is the Arts and Industries building on the National Mall. And you'll see that some of the pieces initially collected kind of outstripped the size of the building. So we have Jupiter C in the front here, and behind, I believe, a Minuteman. But the missiles you can see farther past the entrance. There's another one. There's two on either side flanking the entranceway. And this was in some ways an evolving project. NASA, obviously, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, starts in 1958, starts sending things and people into space. And at first, NASA was a little reluctant to transfer anything to any other institution. They built all of this, they flew it, they'd like to keep it. But by 1964, NASA starts to get really overwhelmed by the loan requests. And they start to realize that if they're going to continue to be an exploration institution, they need somebody else to be the loan management institution, and they turn to the Smithsonian. So there was an agreement between NASA and the National Air and Space Museum signed in 1967 that creates a little bit of a special relationship that existed for some years between the institutions. And as a result, the foundation of the Apollo collection, flown spacecraft, spacesuits, associated equipment, space food, really begins to be transferred to the museum in several batches beginning in December of 1969. And with that in mind, the museum is in the project of building this new building, which is what opened on the National Mall in 1976. And the National Air and Space Museum's building, which was not the beginning of the museum, as you know, but the beginning of it having a dedicated space, was really considered a bicentennial present from the country to the country, right? So for July 1st, for that July 4th weekend of the bicentennial year in 1976, this building on the National Mall opened, and they were really thinking about some of those large objects when they were putting that design together. But for the Apollo program, then, flown spacecraft really were the main focus of the collecting, especially this prize of the collection, the Apollo 11 Command Module Columbia. So you need to think just a little bit about how recent that collecting was when they were doing this in the early 1970s. So the Apollo missions flew between 1968 and December of 1972. And this collecting is happening starting in 1969 and through to the building opening in 1976. So this is really the equivalent of collecting around COVID right now. You know, if you were doing like a whole COVID museum, this would be things that were that recent in people's memory. That program that was held, so just since more and more, I was not alive for the Apollo 11 moon landing, and more of our audience wasn't. So this was the project. It aimed to land human beings on the moon as a part of the space race, which was a battlefield in the Cold War, that geopolitical conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union that starts with the end of the Second World War and runs through the early 1990s. And as a part of this, you're using the same technologies that had otherwise been built to launch nuclear weaponry, and instead you're turning them to a peaceful purpose and demonstrating technologically what you can do with this. So it starts with that declaration from President Kennedy of we will put man on the moon, and the astronauts always emphasize the part about and return him safely to the Earth. And as a part of that, then you have this vehicle being built by North American Rockwell, which has a Pittsburgh connection, and ultimately 24 astronauts orbited the moon and 12 walked on the lunar surface doing experiments, leaving behind instrument packages that would continue to do science for years on end. And the flown spacecraft, when there's this initial collecting, is really seen as this is the physical evidence of what has been done. So even before Columbia came to the National Air and Space Museum, it was sent around the country on a 50-state tour, went to all of the state capitals between April 1970 and May 1971. So it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that this early collecting is really spacecraft-centered. And here's where I get a little pedantic. So indulge me as I explain this. When the museum catalogs objects, each object gets an individual number that begins with a year. So A for artifact, I if it's a loan for incoming, D if it's deaccession, T if it's temporary, and the curator still needs to do their job and get it to an A number. But A, the year in this case for Columbia, 1970, and then a 4-digit identifier. We literally start with 0001 for the first object cataloged in the year, and everything after that gets a number. And then the little extension, which we often call like a paren, 000, means if you've got multiple pieces to a thing, the main thing gets 000, the main accessory might get 001, 002, but so it's a way that we can kind of group things together, that we know, these are pieces of the same thing. So a few things about this. As NASA begins transferring things to the museum in December of 1969, the Apollo 11 Columbia is a central part of that. And then there are also cameras, lenses, in-flight garments, flight plans, checklists, other kinds of things. Initially, today, we always make sure every single thing gets its own number, right? This is how we track it. This is how we keep track of everything. We worked with a large registrarial department, collections department that keeps track of all this stuff. I'm taking you down this weird and slightly boring road because what's interesting to me is that when the initial batches of Apollo material showed up in 1969 and 1970, they didn't get full individual numbers, A, 1970, number. They all were cataloged as extensions of the Apollo 11 command module. Right, so 001, 002, 003, right, so years later, not that many years later, these were all recatalogued in order to give, I think, the importance and recognize that astronaut equipment, things like that, did in fact merit consideration as objects in their own capacity. But initially, it's literally an extension of the capsule as the most important testimony for showing that we've been to the moon and back. So something like this, space food. So this is a package of pineapple fruitcake that was flown on Apollo 11, shockingly not eaten, was added to the museum's collection. But for a long time, things like this would not have necessarily been considered tracking individually and getting that kind of a treatment that would give it a proper place in the catalog. So when we look back at some of these collections, we find that things like space food, astronaut equipment, even rocket engines, the collections were large in size, they were numerous in volume, often full of duplication. Many times the museum accepted many more examples of a thing than really any one museum needed, and the idea was really that was because that early expectation was that these needed to be loaned out around the world in order to demonstrate what had been done by the United States, and that the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum was really going to be the vehicle for managing those international loans. So one of the museum's early souvenir catalogs informed readers, quote, "If you see a genuine U.S. spacecraft in a museum anywhere in the world, it is almost certainly from this collection, exclamation point." And that same catalog comfortably called the hardware the historic relics of space exploration. And that word relics is very deliberately chosen. In fact, it was repeated again in the next sentence. So these have that bit of being the physical talisman that carry the importance and show the history. So my next phase that I want to talk about is as early as 1971, the museum begins accepting artifacts that illustrate not only how Apollo had been accomplished, but also how it was being remembered and how it was being recognized as something of worldwide importance. So in 1973, a numismatist named Thomas W. Becker, that's fancy for coin and metal collector, donated 45 artifacts, including 43 medals, a coin, and a special commemorative plaque, all from production of mints in the U.S. and around the world, and the greatest number of those, 16, celebrated Apollo 11, including the 3 seen here. So from the left, it's a Spanish medal by Calico Barna depicting President Nixon in profile, president during the landings. Silver medal by Paul Vincennes, which is very triumphant man standing on the moon. And then the one on the far right is from the Vienna Mint, and I like it in particular because the engraver and the designer did actually try, even in the very small form, to make each of the three astronauts look like, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins, and depicted them as individuals. Sometimes you get just three heads, sometimes you get three helmets, like they just punted completely on the individual depictions. But these commemorative medals start to come into the collection and fit the curator's interest in featuring fine art at the new museum on the National Mall, because actually the National Air and Space Museum is not only charged with preserving aviation and spaceflight, but also with having a fine art collection. I'll come back to that in a second. But for right now, if I return to my metaphor of cathedrals, for Apollo in the mid-1970s, we have here two different depictions of ways that there are spaces being constructed to commemorate the lunar landings. So on the left, you see the three Apollo 11 astronauts standing at the Washington National Cathedral in 1974. This is an event for the 5th anniversary of Apollo 11. And so in the middle there, in the darkest suit, is Neil Armstrong. To his left with the red tie is Mike Collins. And in the lighter suit to the right is Buzz Aldrin. And they are then marking the space window being installed above them that holds that real lunar sample in the top of the central pane. So on the right, you'll see in 2 years later, the beginnings of the National Air and Space Museum. This is obviously before everything is fully installed. And so the 1903 Wright Flyer hanging in the center of the Central Hall and waiting on their stands to be moved into position are Friendship 7, John Glenn's Mercury spacecraft. You're looking at the shield, the heat shield on the right-hand side for Gemini 4, which was the first American spacewalks in 1965, and Columbia sitting in the middle there waiting for their unveiling as a part of that bicentennial moment. And I think that that particular grouping really reinforced that present of the museum as a present to the nation, with a very clear message that Americans were citizens of the country that had invented the airplane and just landed on the moon. Happy birthday. So populating that space really then brings us to broadening the collection. So in 1975, just a year before opening that, the museum acquired NASA's fine art collection. So beginning in 1962, the space agency invited dozens of artists to document the human spaceflight program any way that they wanted to. So this is a watercolor done by Crystal Jackson, illustrating the Apollo Command Module Simulator, which was an assemblage of computers and screens surrounding a command module mock-up in Houston. It had earned the nickname from the astronauts of the Great Train Wreck, because it does really look like all of these things have just been bashed together. We have all of those components at the National Air and Space Museum. We're actually working on a loan with the London Museum of Science, sending some of those components over to them. But we love being able to not only have the hardware, but then these fine art reaction to that. So the development of the National Air and Space Museum's building on the National Mall is guided by Apollo 11 command module pilot and later museum director Michael Collins, seen here on the left in front of the framework of that building on the National Mall. And then he was kind enough to actually contribute dozens of pieces of personal equipment and his own private mementos to enliven the displays in the museum's new building. So notably, and I've got a picture of one at the bottom for Apollo 7, he had Robin's medallions. So these are basically memorabilia created exclusively for the astronaut corps. Even the astronauts wanted a souvenir of the moon landings and of what they had done. So they worked with the Robbins Company in Attleboro, Massachusetts, to create these precious metal. They tended to be silver or gold. medals that start with usually the mission patch on the front, and on the back they have everybody, depending on the mission patch, names on the front, but then also places to engrave what the dates of the launch, if there was a moon landing, when the moon landing was, and then when it returned to the Earth. And I will tell a little story on how crushed things are for time when you're trying to finally build a brand new museum, and they were rushing to meet that deadline because the hard deadline of July 1 of 1976 could not be moved. Everyone expected the museum to be done, and many of these medallions that he had brought in, because they were just his thing, they weren't necessarily cataloged yet, they nailed them to the wall, like stuck them to the wall and went thonk, thonk, thonk with penny nails and nailed them to the wall. It's not in time, so when we took them down in 2008, you could for many of them, you could take the nails off, and they had either sweated themselves essentially into the paint over the years and attached themselves, so they just hung there in a kind of horrifying way if you're in charge of memorabilia, and we now catalog those things and think they're very important. Or it's entirely possible that the paint was very slightly damp still when they stuck these things to the wall. So our practices change. We get better at what we do. And it takes a few more years to consider memorabilia as a museum object, as something that we might collect. And so, for instance, this is amongst the first examples of commercially available Apollo memorabilia that was added to the collection. So we got a collection of 33 mission patches donated in 1982 by Mance Clayton. And these are not the beta cloth patches that are on the fireproof material that were on the astronaut suits. This is the kind that was sewn, and you might have picked them up as a souvenir if you were at the Cape or anywhere in the late 1960s. In fact, you can see that the stitching is a bit imperfect. There's a couple little extra threads that are coming off the edges. And I think as we've developed how we think about the Apollo program, these really become important objects that show us how ordinary people were connecting with what was happening, wanted some sort of physical thing to connect them to that. So years later, we got another piece of evidence of how most people actually experienced the Apollo program, which is television. So in 2009, the museum, and I was actually able to propose this, we got this from Walter Lister. He was a producer for CBS News. And this is the model of the lunar module, the lunar lander created by Grumman, that Walter Cronkite used on air in 1969 to explain to the American public what they were going to be seeing. This is an era before you had the capacity for lots of sophisticated graphics. They were working really with live models, demonstrations, things like that. So he would hold this and he could separate the top from the bottom and show you how the ascent stage would come off. But it was going to be thrown out. And Walter Lister brought it home because he thought his daughter's Girl Scouts troop would maybe get a kick out of getting to see it, and allowing him to explain to them what had been done. So I love having this material evidence in the Smithsonian's National Collection that helps to tell that story of how most people in the world actually got to experience the Apollo program, which was mediated by television and explained to them by models by someone as distinguished as Walter Cronkite. So I'll end with this set of objects that speaks, I think, as we get to more recent times, to the symbolic power of Apollo. So this is pieces of the F1 engine that was at the bottom of the Saturn V that launched the Apollo missions. So when this rocket was completely together, it's 363 feet tall. What you get back is that command module and what fits in it, prioritizing the people and the experiments, bringing them back safely. But these are expendable rockets. So for as large as this was, it had 5 massive F1 engines at the bottom. That's the injection plate off on the right. And We know that this is one of the ones that was at the bottom of Apollo 11 in July of 1969. We know that from the serial numbers on it. And Jeff Bezos, who is of Amazon.com fame and a Blue Origin founder, funded an expedition in 2012 to try to see if he could recover the actual F-1 engines that had powered Apollo 11. And so this is their picture of finding this on the Gulf floor. And the group succeeded and was able to bring these massive engine components up. And of the 6 pieces that were brought into the collection, we've been able to put 4 on exhibit. And one of those started as a part of the Traveling Destination Moon Anniversary exhibit, seen again here at the Heinz History Center. So just to say, when we started talking about gathering many, perhaps more things than the museum needed because we would think about putting them out on loan. This is also a place where technically we already have F-1 engines, and they're not all broken and rusted. But symbolically, this is incredibly important that this is one of the authentic ones that launched Apollo 11. And so I think it speaks both to being able to illustrate that actual technology, but also to that symbolic power of Apollo, in particular for Jeff Bezos, who is now in the spaceflight business, having grown up as a fan of the Apollo program. And so being able to reconnect that piece and have it in kind of visual conversation with the Apollo 11 command module, I think is particularly powerful. And I love that Pittsburgh was one of the sites for that Destination Moon show because I think Pennsylvania has such an important role in the Apollo program. So Westinghouse built some of the Apollo television cameras. Alcoa and U.S. Steel were providing the material backbone for the rockets and the vehicles. North American Rockwell was building the command modules. You can see downstairs, Jack Kinsler with a Pittsburgh connection built the telescoping pole that held the American flag as it was planted on the moon, because you can't just hang a flag from a straight pole on the moon. It will flop entirely. So he worked out what they were going to need to be able to bring that to the moon and be able to mount it and have it look right in all of the pictures. So I think it's really no wonder that the Heinz History Center was selected as one of just 4 locations across the country, along with Houston, Seattle, and St. Louis, for this historic exhibit, and in fact that it was so well received here. The permanent exhibit about the Apollo program is now installed in the National Mall building of the National Air and Space Museum. It features Columbia, again, at the center, along with many examples of, in fact, many of the objects that I've shown you today. And I'll point out also just that as our techniques change, we increase who we can connect with. So you'll notice that we not only have Columbia on display, Columbia has also been 3D scanned, and there is an incredibly detailed digital model that allows any researcher who wants to know anything about the interior or exterior of that vehicle to be able to explore that. But then if you look on the little panel in front of it, there's a tiny little plastic command module that's touchable, right? So what we find at the museum is when we try to make something more accessible for folks who are blind or who have low vision, to create something touchable so that you have a way of interacting with the exhibit, what we find is most people like to touch stuff. So the more that we put things out that are touchable or interactive, animated, that bring things to life, we find that that not only broadens the public that we can serve, but our general public tends to like those other ways of connecting with things. There's also then a digital walkthrough of the expanded Destination Moon exhibit. So there's an online version of this, and you can digitally walk through a high-definition version of this. And I bring this up not only to show you that, but also to show you the Pennsylvania connection that we have there. So this is a large wall case that is illustrating how widely distributed the contributions to the Apollo program were. At one point, we know as many as 400,000 people were working on the Apollo program. And so we have featured here just a few places across the country that had those connections and some of the products that were contributed to this larger project. I will point out that below Pennsylvania, you've got a little line that goes down, and there's a machete there with a sheath, and that is a machete that was specially constructed for the Apollo program. They carried it with them, not to the moon, but it was aboard the craft so that when they came back and splashed down, if they needed to cut themselves loose from the parachute leads, they could use that. If they did not get picked up promptly by the Navy and they needed to use this for survival to be able to, say, land on an island, and all of the astronauts did training on this, could they survive for a couple of days on an island until they were rescued? And the being able to cut down leaves or branches, being able to cut wood was very useful. So that machete is a case knife that was made in Bradford, Pennsylvania, in Northwest PA. My hometown. So I was not on the team that put this together, but I think I've yammered on enough about Western PA in our general staff meetings that when they had to come up with objects that they wanted to illustrate this particular point, they thought it would be a good idea to bring out the case knife from Western Pennsylvania. So I hope that at some point you might come to the museum and get to explore the exhibit in person, but if not, go find us online, and you can essentially walk around the exhibit at your home computer. So as we return to the space window where we began, I'll ask the question, what do we learn from examining those generations of Apollo artifacts? I think the first generation of Apollo artifacts, that spacecraft-centered generation, was really about how Apollo was done. People had just seen it on television. They wanted to come and see the authentic things that had really been a part of making that happen. And as a research collection, those relics of hardware actually continue to hold lessons for a next generation. So for instance, when the heat shields were being developed for NASA's more recent Orion spacecraft, there were engineers from NASA who came to the museum who wanted to see the Apollo heat shields and be able to not only read the manuals about how they were constructed, but see a physical example of them. So they continue to hold purpose and information and learning for a next generation. But to build on that foundation, then the museum acquired collections that showed how Apollo was being remembered in its own time. And in recent years, then, we've added the artifacts that illustrate people's work and those personal connections to the Apollo program, from everyday engineers to people as distinguished as Neil Armstrong himself. And I think that those most recent additions really broaden the focus from just what Apollo did to include also then what it meant. And so across the generations, our goal is that museum collections are a touchstone and a material resource for those who want to explore this history, both at the Smithsonian and at excellent institutions such as the Heinz History Center. So I'm delighted to have gotten to talk to you about that this evening. Thank you for your time. And I understand we have some time for questions and answers.
I want to be the first.
Oh, okay. Yes, sir. And we have a mic coming around.
It's
so put
right
your hand
here
up.
in my hand.
Yes.
Jess Smythe is Johnny on the spot. But thank you so much for being here and sharing some of your insights. But as you were talking, I was thinking, boy, you've got Buck Rogers' ray gun, and you've got the pieces of the Wright Flyer that Neil Armstrong brought with him to the moon. Do you have a favorite object of all those thousands of things you have in whether the space collections or the National Air and Space Museum's collections? What's your favorite?
Who's your favorite child?
Yes,
That's what
I know
we
it's
want
tough.
to know. So I will cheat slightly. I work with what we call our social and cultural history of spaceflight collection, which means I deal with our memorabilia of the actual spaceflight programs as well as our space science fiction objects. So I pick one real and one imagined. Of the real, I'm a real fan of Friendship 7, John Glenn's spacecraft. It's a Mercury spacecraft. It's only about 6 feet wide, built for one person. Very small couch with a dashboard that really was just inches from his nose. The Mercury astronauts joke that wasn't so much that you got in it as that you strapped it on. It was that kind of small, and they tended to be slightly smaller in stature. But I love also that one of the things they were concerned about was whether his eyes would change shape without the pull of gravity. And so there's a little paper eye chart that was just taped in, and one of his tasks was to read that repeatedly. So I love that detail that connects us to this, how much wasn't known about the science at the time. And then on the imaginary side, the Smithsonian holds the 11-foot studio model of the Star Trek Starship Enterprise. Always a favorite. So this was in an era before computer-generated imaging. If you wanted a spaceship in your TV show or movie, you had to physically build one and film it. And so that is what this is for the original Star Trek television series from 66 to 69. And we did a massive renovation and conservation project on that in between 2014 and 2016. And I spent a lot of time with that model and the paint and the decals on the windows and the color and the tracings, and very pleased with how many fans turned out with kind of information and support and really hard questions about what needed to be done. And I'm delighted how well that has been received. So those are, sometimes your most problematic child becomes a favorite. So.
All right, next question. I'm going to take one over here. My name is Jessica. I will be walking around with the microphone, so just raise your hand, catch my eye. I see a couple over there, so I'll come over there next.
I hope I can make this make sense. I think museums are so important to get to touch things or see things for yourself, but I know other people would say preservation should be king. Lock it up so you can keep it for longer. So I'm just curious about your philosophy on finding that line between those two important things.
Right, because if we really want to keep it, we're going to lock it in a dark closet and just shut the door, not let any light on it, not let it vibrate as people walk past it. We try hard to think carefully about how durable things are in order to be able to put them out, and then have plans informed by our scientists about how long things can stay out, how many foot candles of light they can stand. And so the curator is, I think, always having to be creative within the very real limitations created by what you can safely put out and how you can be able to hit that balance between sharing the history, allowing people to see the real things, and then always rotating them back into storage also so that they get to stay for a very, very long time.
I'm going to bounce around to each section, but we do account for quite a bit of Q&A during this because I know people have questions, so I promise I'll do my best to get to everyone.
And I'll try to keep my answers a little trim. My kids get after me that I give too much detail.
Hi, so my question's kind of along the same line.
Okay.
When this was here a few years ago, I was volunteering at the planetarium and we were doing things jointly. And like something like this is kind of priceless. Like there's only one Apollo 11 capsule, and like along the lines, like in the 70s, I guess like King Tut's head, face mask went around.
Yeah.
Like how do you insure it? Like how are you afraid of it's gonna break? Like how can you just travel the world with this thing and not get damaged or lost?
Yeah. We always work with the knowledge that we can always make something worse, right? We could always screw this up. So we work very hard to try to figure out what are all the contingencies so that we don't. And I get to say we about an awful lot of stuff that involves a big, big team that's beyond the scholar who's saying, I get to pick what things should we exhibit, why, what stories can we tell with it, and then I work with these big teams who are very expert in rigging and being able to hang things without breaking the building or the object, and being able to support things, being able to move them around without damaging them. I'll tell just one brief story, which is that if the museum is moving something, we tend to move it in the, something big, we tend to move it in the middle of the night so that we're not taking things out on the Beltway when like everybody else is moving around. They will do a dry run on the route with the truck, especially if you have something on an open bed where, so we'll have it wrapped, we'll have it protected, but they'll do a dry run with the truck, and then they'll put a pole up and out of the window to the max height of what they know the rig will be, and then they will do that dry run the morning or right before they're going to go, because they're always worried that like a storm brought a wire down and the wire is now lower than it was 3 days ago and we don't want to hook something. So I'm always impressed by the repetition of checking all of those things in order to make sure that things show up properly, because if it's just locked in a crate, then we've lost the ability for the object to educate, for it to inspire, and so we just do everything we can to make sure that we're trying to keep them safe.
Well, I was not only alive during that day in July of 1969, but I worked on the Apollo project. I was at the Space Center when Apollo 11 launched. And I have such great memories of that significant achievement. And I'm so happy that we're able to do this kind of thing and connect it to people, because I think it's important for people to connect back to what we really did. And I'm encouraged that we're getting back into space now a little bit more and continuing that legacy.
Thank you very much for your work.
What?
No, I wanted him to ask if other people were working on the space project.
Is he the only one, or do we have other people in the room? Here we go. There we go.
A couple. Wow.
Can you stand?
Yes, this gentleman also has a question, so I'll go to him next.
One of the wonderful things, and one of the really challenging things about being a curator, I think, especially representing the Smithsonian, there's almost always somebody in the audience who knows more than you, who built it, who flew, and so I always try to be. I love the opportunity to get to talk to folks who were there and who have that hands-on experience and knowledge.
So I have an indirect connection. Vanguard 1 was launched on my birthday in 1958. And I remember it, but that's not the point.
Okay.
I lived 9 miles from the Spacecraft Center in Houston.
Okay.
And my father worked there, and many of the men in the neighborhood worked there. I knew flight controllers. I used to babysit for Deke Slayton. So, but the thing is, I have some material from the local newspapers and so forth. How do I make that available if you want it?
I'll be up here. I'll have cards.
Okay.
Let's talk.
All
Newspapers, things like that, would likely, we would talk to our archives. And one of the things that the Smithsonian really takes very seriously is these partnerships that we have with museums around the world, around the country, around the world. And it doesn't all have to come to the National Air and Space Museum in order for us to be telling this story really well and preserving it well.
I also want to ask a question from our online audience
Yes,
to include
please.
them in. So someone asked if the Smithsonian is interested in commercial space artifacts, like from SpaceX, from Blue Origin, some of what you mentioned.
Yes, we've just hired a new curator. Dr. Emily Margolis is our new curator of contemporary spaceflight, and we're thinking about that broadly. So she just collected the very first ever U.S. Space Force uniform from General Raymond, who was the inaugural general who was standing up that newest branch of the military service. And then also we have representation from Blue Origin as well as from SpaceX that will be a part of a gallery that she is co-curating and will be opening this summer called Futures in Space, really looking broadly at all of these questions about who is working in this space flight now. So yes, online, great question. We're definitely thinking about that, and in fact, bringing in a new curator to focus exactly on that.
This is sort of an offbeat question, but the lunar module descent stages that are still on the moon, are they considered museum property? Or do they still belong to NASA?
It's a real question, right? So when you land on the moon, you've got, that two-part thing. Let me see if I can just pull my little model up. See, it's useful, Walter Cronkite and me. So the bottom with the legs stays on the moon, and then that little bulbous top part has an engine in the middle of it, and that blasts off, and that's the piece that goes up and connects to the kind of conical command module. That's what gets you back from the moon. So all of those things, including the instrument packages, things like that, are still on the moon. It's an active question and an active part of debate right now, because especially as you've got more commercial concerns that are interested in being on the lunar surface, when you had things like the Google Lunar X Prize, one of the ways that you demonstrated that you were on the lunar surface was by imaging an Apollo landing site. Well, we don't want people landing on the Apollo landing sites and like blowing away all of, the various footprints from the dozen people who walked around on the moon. So it is an active area that people are talking about. It's not held by the museum. The analogy is often to Antarctic sites, which are considered kind of owned by whoever created them, even though they're not a part of on a national piece of territory. But it is still something that lawyers are looking at to try to figure out, who exactly owns all of that. As I talk about the cathedral building and the generations of curators, some curator generations after me is going to have to go up and put the little stanchions up and tell people to back up.
Okay, I'm going to hit back here, and then I'm going to come back to this middle section.
Would you please tell us a little more about the artifact that's in the cathedral window, why it was chosen, and how that came to be?
Excellent question. The rock sample that's in the middle of the cathedral window is a part of the lunar samples that came back. Those are still all controlled by NASA. So there are no lunar samples that are kind of out in the wild. NASA holds on to them, and they're still used for research. But they did decide to set some samples aside that they knew would be important. So there were things given to like the 50 states. There were little tiny samples that are encased in lucite that were handed out around the world as a part of a global tour. That piece was selected to be a part of that design of the space window that would be making that connection in Washington, D.C. with the National Cathedral. We also have a touchable moon rock at the National Air and Space Museum that is still held by NASA, but they have it on a permanent loan to us, and we have a great picture of that rock on the moon that was taken during Apollo 17, that we know that they then picked that rock up off the surface and brought it back and sliced it so that you can come to the museum and have a touchable piece of the moon. We have a science department that's the Center for Earth and Planetary Studies, who are lunar geologists, planetary geologists who are working on planetary studies, and so that connection with the real science was the founding scientist for that was the gentleman who was training the astronauts as geologists to be able to go and pick up the samples. So that connection has been a very strong one since the 1970s.
All right, I've seen this hand up front. Do we have another one in the back in the middle section? I just want to make sure I'm getting front and back.
Hi. And I say maybe both fictional and non-fictional, but is there an artifact or a story or a piece of information that you know existed or you know exists, but you don't have? And this is a personal question. Like, of course, the museum has things they want, but you personally, is there something you know exists that you don't have and you'd love to have?
I'm not going to get it. So one of the Space Craze is my book that where I really looked at the museum's collection of memorabilia about how spaceflight has been remembered and how spaceflight has been imagined in fictional terms, and tried to use that as a way to kind of tell the story of the 20th century in terms of how Americans have connected to imagination about spaceflight. And one of the stories I tell in the book is from the 1980s. There was a program that was run through the Reagan White House. It was a young astronaut program, and like Omni Magazine and Commodore Computers, and they were interested in getting young people interested in spaceflight and specifically the space shuttle and getting them enthusiastic about that, and through that getting them excited about science and math. It's a kind of early precursor to what we would now do in terms of, STEM education. And they created a young astronaut branded Cabbage Patch Kid. Like there was a line of them. You could get them, and they came with a little spacesuit, and the box looked like a little rocket. But there was one that was presented to Ronald Reagan in a ceremony around the Young Astronaut Program. They gave him one of these Young Astronaut Cabbage Patch Kids in the early 1980s, and I thought, I was working on an exhibit. I'm like, that's what I want. That would be really cool. So I looked all over, called the Cabbage Patch people, who were a little horrified to realize we didn't already have it. They thought it had been given to the Smithsonian. In the end, probably 2 years of research later, I realized someone at the White House gave it to a Toys for Tots drive that Christmas. So like some kid who got an astronaut Cabbage Patch Kid got the one that was handed to Ronald Reagan on the South Lawn. And sure, Oh, very good. I've since gotten examples, though that one is, I think, lost to history. But they're a great piece. They're really fun. And but that was a kind of disappointing end to the research project to realize, like, oh, it's gone. And in my arc of today's talk about how it's only slowly that people realize that the memorabilia, the toys, the games, the patches, the commemorative pieces around stuff are just as important and museum worthy as the spacesuits and the food and the art, the spacecraft. They weren't there yet in the early 80s.
What a lucky kid. I'm
Yes.
gonna take our next question here.
Okay, so I'm gonna see if this makes sense.
Okay.
But as we have kind of left the Apollo era and that era where space and space flight were extremely in the public consciousness, how do you think shifting into the future, how are we going to be seeing space in popular culture and the news and all of that stuff into the future?
Great question. It's one of the challenges that we have at the museum, and so we've got a new exhibit that's coming up that we're calling Living in the Space Age, which is really about the ways that space flight technologies have become increasingly invisible, but they are really defining who we are and where we are, literally where we are, right? All kinds of things are GPS enabled, not started as a military system, but it's part of what got me from DC to here today. It's part of what allows you to find, where's your nearest coffee place to be able to get something. Where's, the kinds of weather reporting that we're used to is coming from space technologies. We expect not just it's going to rain this afternoon, but that you can look at your phone and have some at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock. That storm should get here. I have time to do something before. So really looking at all of the ways that we now are living on a planet that is surrounded by these constellations of satellites that are giving us all kinds of feedback about our environment, about our oceans, and thinking about the ways that we can try to make that more visible for people and understand that we're really living still in a space age, and that we're living on this planet that is surrounded by satellites that are feeding back all kinds of information all the time. Great question.
I have our next one right here.
Okay.
Yes. Can you tell me the top secret on how to get tickets online? And if not, can you just give me 2 tickets?
Oh, so the National Air and Space Museum right now has free timed tickets in order to get in part because half the building is still closed, and we want to make sure everybody has a good experience. So if you're planning your trip to Washington, D.C., you do want to log in, get a card from me. I'll see what I could do. It's been nice because it gives us a good sense of who's in, and we're getting good feedback from people about, it kind of helps them organize their day instead of vaguely we're going. They have some sense like we have 2 o'clock tickets. We want to be lining up, and we've been able to move people through pretty fast. But yeah, it is for those of us who grew up just being able to wander in off the street. It's a slightly different experience to have to plan out your trip a little bit. Oh, okay. Oh. And they do also have walk-up tickets on the day of, because, so I'm sorry if you weren't able to get there, and let me see what I can do.
It's just that popular of a museum. It's in high demand. What do you think about 1 or 2 more questions?
Sounds great.
Wonderful. I
Thank
also
you.
want to make sure you guys know that Dr. Weitekamp will be signing books after, and so we have a table just off to the stage. Yeah? Okay.
I'm glad that picture's up. That's kind of my question.
Okay.
So how did the museum hear about this artifact? Because you mentioned it was intended to go to a Girl Scout troop as an
Yeah.
example. And then going to that, today, how does the museum handle acquisitions? Are you handling it sort of like this gentleman who is coming to you and saying, I have this thing that I think is of historical importance, or are you doing research and hunting down items that you think may exist, or and looking out for them in the world?
We do both, right? So if we're developing an exhibit, if we're watching what's going on in the world, and we're historians, but we're also always kind of keeping an eye on what's current. We will be keeping an eye on my colleague who works on the history of planetary science is always keeping an eye on when are they done with the flight spare, right? So if you send a rover to Mars, you don't only build one, you tend to actually build fully 2 of them so that you have one on the ground that you can continue to experiment with. He'll keep in touch with the lab that's running that rover that's still on Mars, and then figure out when it is that we can get the flight spare. Until then, can we get a model, things like that. So for social and cultural memorabilia, what I get is people will raise their hand or call me or email me. I have a thing. That was with Walter Lister. We got a call from his widow who was going through his things and realized that he still had this, and maybe the museum would be interested. And it's always an interesting conversation to try to get some sense of the fuller history of what the object was, how it was used, what kinds of stories it brings in. I'm often, as a curator, looking for what I would think of as a rich artifact that allows me to tell lots of different stories, not only about him and his work with CBS News, but perhaps about the audience on the other side of all of those cathode ray tubes watching those broadcasts. So it's a combination of people will offer things, we go looking for stuff, and then the job really is that you say no more than you say yes, in order to be as judicious as we can, so that we're mindful of our space and the fact that we're committing the institution to caring for an object in perpetuity.
I had a question regarding, so when I was a kid growing up, we all had a snow day or something, and we had to watch the Challenger. And I wondered if it's harder for curators to, when it's a tragedy, to select pieces as the memorabilia.
Great question. Yes, and for all of these things, we're very aware that we're often it's real people, right? So I was part of a team that went to Sally Ride's house after she died. I was a part of a team that went to Neil Armstrong's house after he died, both in 2012. And this is, Neil Armstrong, it's like, going to Christopher Columbus's house. I mean, but that's also their dad and their person. And so trying to both talk about and represent what the Smithsonian will bring to this, but then also just who you are. It became clear at some point that Mrs. Armstrong kept saying she wanted to, we should have lunch. She wanted us to have sandwiches. And it became clear to me, she needs us to just sit at her table for a minute and eat sandwiches. And have some idea of who's going through her husband's office. And so that kind of relationship building really one-on-one is part of not only, of building that trust so that then we can bring things in when it's a tragedy. We have some things from Columbia and in 2003, and also Challenger in 1986, and we've stayed in touch with the families and thought about how we tell that story within the context of also all of the successful flights of the space shuttle, so that it doesn't somehow become distorted by the overwhelming memory of those lost lives. So it's a balancing act to try to think every time about what's the storytelling that we're doing, and how are we being respectful of the real people who lived it. Thank you.
I am going to cut questions there because I want to make sure we have time to get some books signed as well. Will you all join me in giving a round of applause to Dr. Weitekamp once again? I just also want to thank you all so much for coming to the first installment of the Smithsonian Lecture Series. I hope you'll join us again for the next 3 in this year. And Dr. Weitekamp will be at this table to sign some books. And if you haven't purchased one already, they're out in the hallway. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.